All right, time to look at redistricting. This is a process related to reapportionment. This is based on the same ideas here that everyone must be treated equally. And so that includes those of us that live inside a state. We must be treated equally to all the other people in the state and make sure that our districts have the same number of people. What you see here is you see some in the background, these guys are working on designing a map of the state of North Carolina. We'll take a look at North Carolina and its map of congressional districts, which is one of the weirdest ones we will see. You can also see all of the United States there. We'll talk about some states that make sense and some states that have the craziest district maps you can imagine. We talked about how the census is completed and we have to make sure that each state has the appropriate number of representatives. So now this is a process that must occur. See, reapportionment does not necessarily affect every state. Some states are helped, some states are hurt, and most states got left alone. Redistricting is something that happens inside each state. If your state has more than one member of the House of Representatives, then those district lines must be redrawn to reflect population changes after each census. So the population is counted for the whole country. We figure out how many seats in the House each state's going to get. But we also count the population inside every single state, and we make sure that the districts are drawn in a way to make sure that there are equal numbers of people in each district in the state. So redistricting is drawing the district lines inside the state. Reapportionment is from one state to another state. Redistricting happens inside a state. So the states also have to track their own population changes. You may have, probably in most states, you're going to have a lot of people moving from rural areas into urban areas inside the state. And so the lines have to be redrawn to reflect those changes. We have to make sure that the people in the state are represented equally. That opens us up to a process that we call gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a form of cheating at redrawing these lines. It's not illegal. In fact, the court refuses to decide whether it is a good process or not. The court just keeps ignoring these questions. But this is a process that is allowed because the legislatures of each state get to draw the lines. And so if the legislatures are controlled by Republicans, they want to draw the lines in a way that helps Republicans. If the legislature is controlled by Democrats, they want to draw the line that helps Democrats win. So the governments use voting predictions based on demographics and voting patterns to draw the lines for districts. So we will see lines drawn in really weird shapes because what they're trying to do is they're trying to capture a certain type of voter inside each district to alter the balance of the district to either make it more Republican voters or more Democratic voters. Over on the right, you see a couple of states to give us an example of what's going on. Now, up top, that is my favorite state district. This is my nerdiest thing. Nebraska has great districts. Nebraska has district number 2, you can see. That's the city of Omaha. It's the biggest city in Nebraska, and it is large enough. It has about 750,000 people, so it gets its own district. So that district is made entirely of city. Then you have number 1 district, which includes the suburbs of Omaha and some what we call exurbs or rural areas near the city. And then you have District 3, which is all of the very sparsely populated farmland. So each of the districts in Nebraska makes sense. Each of the representatives in Nebraska has a district similar of similar people. So the representative for District 2 can represent city interests. The representative for District 3 can represent farming interests, and they have good districts and good jobs for these representatives. Then take a look at Ohio down below. You you take a look at Ohio here, and I'm not expecting you guys to know where the cities in Ohio are, but the blue districts there, Ohio's shapes are very, very strange here. Ohio is controlled by Republicans, and the lines are drawn to maximize the Republicans' chances of winning the most number of seats in Congress. You would look at the blue spaces and you could assume that those were urban population areas, and that is true. That is what the blue spaces you see are. You can see around Cleveland, you can see around Columbus. But one thing they've done here, down in the bottom left corner, there is another very big city. There's Cincinnati, and Cincinnati's districts have been drawn in a way to diminish the voting power of the Democrats in the city there. So this is what we call a gerrymandered state. Those shapes make no sense, but those shapes are drawn in a way to maximize the voting power of the Republican voters in the state. So gerrymandering, this process is not actually illegal, but it's not really cheating, but that's kind of what's going on here. They are using their ability. What they're supposed to do is make sure that the district lines have equal numbers of people in each district. What they end up doing is making sure that the district lines allow the dominant political party in the state to help itself or hurt its opponent. So since the state legislatures in most states draw the district lines, those legislatures are made up of Republicans and Democrats. This is not a process only Republicans do. This is a process that Democrats do in Democrat states as well. It's just that Democrats don't run many state legislatures. So what you can do when you draw these lines is that you can draw the lines in a way to make a district up of mostly conservative or mostly liberal voters. And this is what we called earlier. We were looking at the elections. We call this a safe district because a district will have overwhelmingly Democratic voters or overwhelmingly Republican voters in it. That means when those candidates are running for reelection, they're going to win easily because it's going to be a Democrat running for reelection in a city where 80% of the voters are Democrat, or it's going to be a Republican running for reelection in a rural district where 80% of the voters are Republican. So neither of those candidates has to work very hard to win reelection. You can also create disadvantages for your opposition group. That's what we just saw on the map where Cincinnati should be. You can draw a district to split up a group of opposite party voters, and that prevents them from having enough votes to win in a district. So we'll look at some examples of this in a minute. We'll see some states that have done some extreme forms of gerrymandering. First, let's take a look at how this process works, see if we can make some sense of it. All right, take a look at my imaginary state here. It's a beautiful state full of Trumps and Clintons. This state is made up of 40% Republicans and 60% Democrats. So hopefully, we would draw these. We got to draw the districts here. We've got to divide the voters up, and we hope that we make some fair districts where Republicans would have a say in the government and Democrats would also have a say in the government. Our only rules in redistricting are that the districts have to have an equal number of people in them, and we have to draw districts so that they're all contiguous. That means each part of the district is connected. We can't have islands of voters. But those are our only rules when we draw the district lines. So let's draw the district lines here and see if we can fairly represent the population. When I draw these lines, I want to make sure that these voters get a chance to have their voices heard. I want to make sure that all the voters are treated fairly. So if I draw the lines like that, I've got some good districts. Each district has the same number of people in it. What I ended up with are districts where the number of Democrats reflects the number of Democrats in the state, and the number of Republicans reflects the number of Republicans in the state. There are 60% Democrats in this state, and so they have 60% of the seats in my legislature here. And the Republicans are not left out of this government. They make up 40% of the state, so they should have their voices heard as well. In this case, they have 40% of the seats in the legislature. I'm going to make my state twice as big so we can look at some of the problems with drawing these district lines here. But in this case, I'm keeping my lines the same way. I've got a good, fair process. I've got a state legislature made up of 60% Democrats and 40% Republicans. That matches my population perfectly. Voters in my state are going to be happy. They're going to think this process is fair and legitimate. Let's take the same state, only this time we're going to let the Democrats draw the line. All right, now Democrats make up a little more than half of the state. Republicans make up almost half of the state. They should have a voice in this government. But if the Democrats get to draw the lines, they can draw the lines differently in a way to take advantage of their numbers. What if the Democrats drew the lines like that? Remember, our only rules were equal numbers of people, and the districts must be contiguous. They must all be touching. Here, the Democrats just drew the line horizontally instead of vertically, and look what happens. Each district has more Democrats than Republicans in it. Each district is fair because it has the same number of people in every district, and each district is contiguous. So these districts would be approved because they meet all the requirements, but these districts would be unfair. In this state legislature, the Democrats would have 100% of the seats. They drew the lines in a way to eliminate the voting power of the Republicans in the state. So this would be an example of a gerrymander, and this would be wildly unfair. In this case, the Democrats took advantage of their numbers. They drew the lines to eliminate any Republican voice in the government. This can work in the reverse. Even though I'm going to take the same state, there are still less Republicans than Democrats in the state. 40% Republicans, 60% Democrats. But I'm going to let the Republicans draw the lines here. If the Republicans happen to run the state legislatures. Now, the rules are the same. Equal numbers of people must be contiguous. The Republicans are not going to be able to completely eliminate the Democrats, but here's what they can do. This looks more like a gerrymander. Look at these stupid shapes right here. Now, these technically, remember our only rule, same number of people in each district. If you count, there are equal numbers of people in each one of these districts. In 3 of these districts, there are more Republicans than Democrats. In 2 of these districts, there are a lot more Democrats than Republicans. What they've done is they've packed the Democrats into as few districts as possible. And the Republicans can draw this line. And even though they only made up 40% of the state, in this case, they would end up with 60% of the seats in Congress, right? They'd have 60% of the votes. This would be an example of a minority population ruling the government. So they've drawn the lines in such a silly way here. These shapes don't make any sense to us, but what these shapes do is these shapes allow the Republicans to have the advantage in 3 of the districts. So they would end up with more votes in the Congress. Gerrymandering is a real thing right here. We've talked about this in class a little bit, but in 2010, the Republicans in the state of Tennessee got to redraw the district that that covers most of Memphis. So on the left, you see what that district looked like from the year 2000 to the year 2010. It's mostly the same, but you can kind of see the shape of the 240 interstate there. In this case, in 2000 to 2010, Congressman Steve Cohen represented this district from 2006 to 2010. It covers all the city of Memphis. It is it's all of Memphis, the city, and then it is even some of the suburbs out in the southeast, going out as far as parts of Collierville. Then in 2010, the Republicans know they're drawing the line, and they want to damage the voting power of this district as much as they can. They know they're not going to be able to eliminate the Democratic voting power in Memphis, but they can harm the candidate here. So you see the shape is very, very different here. They've drawn this shape out of the middle of East Memphis there, and this is what we call the Poplar Corridor. This actually includes White Station High School. It's the neighborhoods just a little bit to the north and a little bit to the south of Poplar, which throughout East Memphis are some of the most affluent parts of the city. Parts of Fraser and Millington became part of the district now, and parts of East Memphis were removed and given to District 8, which is going to be won by the Republican because it's a mostly rural district. So if you looked at this on the surface, the Democratic representative of Memphis should not be super upset because they gained more Democratic voters when they picked up Fraser and even parts of Millington. And so their job in winning votes might have gotten even easier because they added more predominantly Democratic areas while they removed areas that were a mix of Democratic and Republican. But what they did remove from the district here is they removed the most affluent parts of the city. Like some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city of Memphis are now a part of District 8. And so now the Republican who serves District 8, which is mostly rural West Tennessee, has a better opportunity to come into Memphis and gain the voters here in East Memphis, but also gain their donations. This helps the Republican candidate in District 8 fundraise better than they would have been with a purely rural district where there's not a ton of affluent neighborhoods. So redistricting in this place, in Memphis here, the gerrymandering that has taken place has changed the shape of District 9 and has changed the makeup of the voters here. After the 2020 census is complete, between 2020 and 2022, they'll redraw this district line again, and we'll see if the district is changed at all and if there are different parts of town or different parts of the suburbs that become back a part of District 9 or if those remain a part of District 8. When gerrymandering happens, we end up with districts that are less competitive. This is bad for us as voters, because the voters, like, we have elections that don't really matter. We looked at the results of the elections in Tennessee a little bit earlier, and Steve Cohen won his district by like 50%. And the David Kustoff in District 8 won his election by like 40%. And most across Tennessee, these districts are not close at all. And that means we don't have a good choice as voters. Like, if you are a Republican voting in the city of Memphis, you have no chance of winning the congressional seat. And if you're a Democrat voting in the city of Memphis, Steve Cohen has no real incentive to listen to you. He's got a safe seat. In District 8, if you're a Democrat, your vote is pretty worthless. And in District 8, if you're a Republican, there's no real reason for David Kustoff to listen to you because he's going to win his election easily every time. So the incumbents are super safe, and this is probably bad for voters overall. And the outcome of these elections is not really represented because of the gerrymandering that takes place here. Here's a recent example of that. Census took place in the year 2010. The districts were redrawn for 2012, and in the 2012 election, what we can look at here, the popular vote is the 8th line down. You can see that nationally, Democrats received 59,600,000 votes. Republicans received 58,200,000 votes. So Democrats got more votes than Republicans nationally in the elections for the House of Representatives. But because of the gerrymandering that took place, despite the fact that they got 1.5 million less votes, Republicans ended up with 56% of the seats. Republicans ended up with 234 seats to Democrats' 201 seats. So this would be an example of a minority voting population having more votes in the legislature because of the way that the lines are drawn. Gerrymandering can also exaggerate the results of elections. So in this case, this was in 2016. The lines are the same as they were in 2012. And what happened in this election, Republicans actually got more votes. They got 63 million votes to Democrats' 61,700,000 votes. So it's about 1.5 million more votes. This was the difference here. So Republicans got more votes than Democrats. They have 1.5 million more votes. You see the percentage down there. They got 49.1% of the vote, and Democrats got 48% of the vote. But Republicans ended up with 57% of the seats, and Democrats ended up with 43% of the seats, despite getting 48% of the vote. Republicans got 49% of the vote, 57% of the seats. Now, this is not a thing that only helps Republicans. This is a thing that helps Democrats too when they have power in some of these states. We will see a couple examples in a minute, but in our current political climate in the last decade, Democrats have done very poorly at the state level, so they do not control many states. They would gerrymander if they had the opportunity to gerrymander, but they do not have the opportunity to gerrymander very often because they control so few seats. So we mentioned these a little earlier when we were doing examples. These are the 3 restrictions on gerrymandering that we have to pay attention to. So the districts must have the same amount of people in them. So the districts have to have equal populations. That's a rule. The districts, the lines must be contiguous. The district must all be connected. We can't just draw islands and say that these 3 separated circles are one of the districts. And the lines, because of the Voting Rights Act, are not allowed to be based solely upon race. This is hard because race overlaps so much with voting patterns here in the United States that it is easy to say that those lines are not drawn based on race. Those lines are drawn based on Democratic voters or something like that. So that one is hard, and that one goes to court often, but that is a rule. You're not allowed to draw these lines based on race. All right, so we're going to take a look at a couple of the worst examples of gerrymandering taking place, and I'll show you a couple of techniques here. So we're going to see real congressional districts, and then we're going to see what would happen if a nonpartisan group drew districts just to make sure that voters were represented reasonably. So that regional, similar parts of the states had districts of their own. So this is Utah. Now look at the one on the right. The nonpartisan group would draw a map for Utah. These shapes would have equal numbers of voters in them. There would be one district for Salt Lake City. There would be another district for south of Salt Lake City and Provo. This is where the colleges are in number 3. And then there would be one big rural district, number 2, and a more rural district up north in number 1. Now, in this map of Utah, there would be a Democrat to represent Salt Lake City because most of the voters in Salt Lake City are Democrats. Most of the voters in the rest of Utah are Republicans, so they should have more seats in the Congress. But what they've done on the left, is what we call cracking. So they have tried to split up the Democrats in Salt Lake City to diminish their voting power. And what you see is there are 4 districts in Utah, pretty weird shapes. And Salt Lake City, depending on what part of Salt Lake City you live in, you might be in any of the 4 districts in Utah. So even though Salt Lake City as a whole has more Democrat than Republican voters, those voters do not have enough votes in any of these 4 districts to elect a member to Congress. Here's Louisiana. Louisiana is another bad example of terrible gerrymandering going on. This is a different strategy, though. So let's start on the right again. If a nonpartisan group drew the lines in Louisiana, we'd see some still weird shapes. Louisiana is a weird shaped state. But these districts would mostly have pretty similar populations. You'd have rural North Louisiana. You'd have 2 would be New Orleans, most of New Orleans there. District 6 would be all the parts like the far suburbs of New Orleans going all the way out to Baton Rouge, the college town. So there probably in Louisiana we would have 2 Democrats elected and 4 Republicans elected. But on the left is how the Republicans drew the districts, and this is what we call packing. They took as many Democrats as possible and squeezed them all into one district. So there is no chance a Republican can win District 2, but the Democrats, like all of the Democrats, live in District 2. And so that means the Republicans will have the numerical advantage everywhere else in the state. They were going to have an advantage anyway, but because of this gerrymandering, because they packed all the voters into one place, the Republicans in the state have maximized the number of seats they can get. Where they probably should have got 4, they're able to get 5 seats in Congress. All right, just to look at some more like really stupid shapes to let you see how this goes. Here's one that Democrats do. Democrats are just as bad as Republicans when they get the chance to do this. This is a district in Chicago. So they have taken a couple areas here of where they can pack Republican voters into a place. And you see that very, very, very skinny line over there on the left. Remember my rule, the district has to be contiguous. It has to be touching. Well, that little line on the left over there is the interstate. There is not one person living on the interstate, but the interstate allows these 2 wealthy Republican parts of Chicago to be connected so that they can pack as many voters in there as possible. And then the yellow areas around are split up into different districts to maximize the number of Democrats. Here's an example in North Carolina. This would be an example of packing. So here, Winston-Salem would probably be able to have a representative of their own, and Charlotte would be able to have a representative of their own. So they'd probably each elect a Democrat, being pretty big cities. But in this case, the Republicans drawing the lines in the state have been able to take half of each of the cities and cram them into one district to diminish the number of Democrats that would be elected in the state. So this is a pattern that we see a couple times. Here was one of our Ohio ones. We see that same pattern again in Ohio. So they have connected all of the coast of Ohio here to make Toledo and Cleveland. Parts of Toledo and parts of Cleveland share a representative, when each of these cities would have enough people to elect a representative of its own, but they have cracked and packed the populations here so that together these 2 cities elect one Democrat instead of each electing a Democrat to the state. And the same thing here in Texas, where they have San Antonio and Austin each should have their own representative. Each of those would be overwhelmingly Democrat cities and elect 2 Democrats to Congress. But in this case, the lines are drawn to share a representative here. And in this case, you have a representative who represents parts of San Antonio and parts of Austin. And in this way, they have made one less Republican in the Congress because they have packed all of the Democrats in these 2 areas into one district. All right, that was very, very long. I'm so sorry, but we had to go through lots of examples of gerrymandering, so you guys make sure you understand what that means. So that is it for Congress. We've gone through everything here. Let's take just a minute and review the big things we need to pay attention to for this set of our notes about Congress. So we need to make sure that we are able to describe the advantages that incumbents have in congressional elections. We need to be able to compare the types of elections for president and the midterm elections. Let's pay attention to the types of voters that are participating, the voter turnout, the different outcomes that we expect to see. We need to make sure that we can explain why reapportionment is so important to states, why states count on that for having a bigger voice in Congress and a bigger voice in the Electoral College. And finally, we need to make sure that we can explain how gerrymandering can be used for political advantage in redistricting. All right, so that is it, our last set of notes. This is all Congress. We are done with Congress. We will now wrap things up. We'll do a little study guide and review everything about Congress, and we'll come back, start moving on to our next branch of government, the executive branch.